What's this? Seems strangely familiar. Is it yours, Joe?
Flute? No.
Well, properly speaking, it's a recorder.
Thank you. I was wondering where that had got to. You haven't been trying to play this, have you? Oh, I can see you've been doing the TARDIS up a bit. I don't like it. Oh, my word. Oh, dear. We are in trouble, aren't we? Just as when I turned up.
Hello and welcome to Who Watches Who, a Doctor Who podcast with me, Matthew, and as always, I am joined with...
Hello, I'm Scott.
Yes, hello Scott, and today we are looking back at an interesting part of Doctor Who. We are looking at the opening to Season 10, the 10th anniversary, and the Three Doctors. You know, it is coming up to the 50th anniversary of the 10th anniversary very soon, which is just a very fun sentence to say. So we decided, fuck it, let's look at this interesting first multi-Doctor story.
And it's a very odd experience watching this again. Last time I watched it was when I was a kid, and I remember it being a bit shit. I think this time I enjoyed it more. I can't wait to get into it.
I had a fun romp with it. I'd only ever seen clips from YouTube, specifically like the William Hartnell like on the TV screen being like, "I am old and dying," but like I've had a fun romp watching it. But this episode first aired on December 30th, 1972, which was 49 years, 10 months, and 10 days ago at the time of recording. Very quickly approaching the 50th anniversary of this 10th anniversary, and it aired on a Saturday. At the time, the US president was, of course, Richard Nixon, with the prime minister being one Edward Heath. Could you guess as to the number one movie at the box office at the end of 1972? This would be impressive.
1970. It's probably some boring old drama, right?
It is old. It is not a drama. It is actually The Poseidon Adventure, which is a 1972 American disaster movie directed by Ronald Name, produced by Irwin Allen, and based on Paul Gialatto's 1969 novel of the same name. It's got an ensemble cast, including 5 Oscar winners with Gene Hackman, Ernest Brogin, Jack Albertson, Shelley Winters, and Red Buttons, which is an incredible name. The plot centers on the fictional SS Poseidon, an aging luxury liner on her final voyage from New York City to Athens before it is scrapped. On New Year's Day, it is overturned by a tsunami. Passengers and crew are trapped inside, and a preacher's attempts to lead a small group of survivors to safety. It sounds pretty fun. It's probably very dated for, a 1972 disaster film, but it is one that I have heard of as like a very fun, like, classic. It's got a very good poster.
Yeah, I've never heard of it, but it makes sense. It was released around New Year's.
Yeah, because it's set
around New Year's. It's a perfect. Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah. On this day in 1972, the US President Richard Nixon halted bombing of North Vietnam and announced peace talks. This is where Vietnam won the war against America. Vietnam War, the United States halts heavy bombing in North Vietnam. I just repeated the same thing twice there. Very cool. But yeah, this is the day, basically, where America was like, hey, we might have lost this war in Vietnam. Whoops, a war that we really shouldn't have been involved in anyway. But if we turn our eye back to history to see what was going on December 30th throughout the world, in 1731, the first ever US music concert is played and held by Peter Pelham's Great Room in Boston. So that's pretty cool. In 1922, the creation of the USSR formally proclaimed in Moscow from the Bolshoi Theater, Soviet Union organized as a federation of RSFSR, Ukrainian SSR, Belarusian SSR, and Transcaucasian SSR. Basically, big USSR Soviet superpower formed in December 30th, 1922, and I'm sure everything was totally chill with them. Since in 1924, astronomer Edwin Hubble formally announces existence of other galaxy systems at a meeting of the American Astronomical Society. Edward Hubble, famously named after a telescope. And it was wild. It was wild researching this that less than 100 years ago we discovered that there were other galaxies. Just thinking about like how far we've come from that. You know, like 98 years ago we were like, holy shit, there's other galaxies. And now we're like just sending people up to space every now and then just for the fucking shits and giggles, you know?
Yeah, it's incredible just how technology itself is just
it's ridiculous.
Dramatically improved since then. It's like, now we're in the metaverse. Holy shit, we've never seen this coming.
No one's in the metaverse. In 1939, Of Mice and Men, starring Burgess Meredith and as George and Lon Chaney Jr. as Lenny, is released. It's not a film I've ever seen. It's a book I vaguely have read in school, I think. You ever?
I don't know anything about it. I just presume it's about mice and men.
It is. Yeah, it is definitely. In 1941, in an emotional speech to the Canadian Parliament, Winston Churchill states that Britain will never surrender to Hitler and his Nazi gang, and that they have asked for total war. Let us make sure they get it. Afterwards, Joseph Karish captures his famous photograph called The Roaring Lion, which is basically every photo of Winston Churchill you'll ever see, where he's kind of just standing there looking grumpy. But very famous speech happened on this day in 1941. And then finally, in 1959, ending with a really piece of fantastic news, George Washington, the first ever ballistic missile submarine, is commissioned, and the whole world shuddered. That is all that I have got on the On This Day segment for December 30th, 1972. Scott, why don't you take us in to a bit of the behind the scenes for this episode?
Yeah, so the writers of The Three Doctors are Bob Baker and Dave Martin, but we've already spoken about them in The Hand of Fear, if you remember that classic.
Oh, what a fantastic episode that was.
Basically, Sarah Jane just walks around
a nuclear power plant. Yep.
It was so good. And we also spoke about a bit about Bob's individual career in our Australian K9 episodes, which I still had fun with that episode.
It was a fun little look into something very strange. Yeah.
This time around we're talking about Terrence Dicks himself, a big guy who was the script editor throughout this entire John Pertwee run. His career actually started in 1962 when Malcolm Hulke, who he had rented a room from, asked to help him with a script with the Avengers episode, and he wound up co-writing 5 episodes of the Avengers with Malcolm Hulke. And we of course spoke about Malcolm Hulke in the other classic, The Sea Devils.
Yep, what another phenomenal episode. Just so good.
And then also before Doctor Who, Terrence Dicks wrote several episodes of Crossroads, which was a soap opera which has kind of been lost to time. I don't hear anyone speaking about Crossroads.
No.
Apart from Nicholas Briggs over at Big Finish. I presume he wants to do a Crossroads revival at some point.
He probably watches it every day. Like, he loves it.
In 1968, he was hired as an assistant script editor on Doctor Who, and got promoted to head script editor the following year. He and Malcolm Hulke wrote the massive 10-part final to Troughton's Run, the War Games, and if you know the story behind that, basically there were 2 scripts that couldn't be filmed, so there was a 6-parter and a 4-parter, and it just scripting issues happened, and they decided to do a big 10-part epic instead, and they wrote that in like a month, which is insane to think about.
That is, that's a lot to do in not a lot of time.
And then Dick served as the script editor for all 5 seasons of Pertwee's run between 1970 and 1974, and he formed a very close bond with producer Barry Letts. Between seasons 10 and 11, the duo even created their own sci-fi series, Moonbase 3. However, it was a complete failure. And just Big Finish spin-off when? I imagine Big Finish will do a spin-off eventually of this.
They love doing them. They love it, Big Finish love doing spin-offs of things that you just don't know about.
Yeah, they do Blake 7, which was created by Terry Nation. Why not do Moonbase 3?
Why not?
That nobody's heard of.
Yep.
During the time of his show, he oversaw many additions to the show's lore, including the introduction of the Time Lords, the name Gallifrey, the creation of Liz Shaw, Joe Grant, and Sarah Jane, the term regenerations, Sontarans, a lot of lore about the TARDIS, including that it may be sentient, and of course he introduced multi-Doctor stories. So without him, really, the show's lore would be so different.
Very different, yeah, very different for sure. Those are some major, especially things that carried over into Modern Who. Those are some major elements that are in Modern Who for sure.
Like, I was just watching The Edge of Destruction the other day, and basically the whole thing was, oh yeah, the TARDIS can't think for itself. It's just a machine that thinks the way machines think. And that was the premise of TARDIS before Terry Dix decided, yeah, of course the TARDIS would be sentient. It's an alien device. Why not?
Yeah, and then flash forward 50 years, it turned into a woman, and it was a very good episode. Love that episode.
After leaving the role of script editor, he continued writing further episodes such as Robot, The Brain of Morbius, It's Morbin Time, Horror of Fang Rock, The State of Decay, and of course finishing off on The Five Doctors, which of course is another multi-Doctor storyline with, funnily enough, only 3 surviving Doctors. Patrick Troughton, John Pertwee, and Peter Davison, because Tom Baker didn't want to do it, and William Hartnell was of course in the grave. So
interesting. That was a bold choice to call it The Five Doctors.
So yeah, this episode we're covering today is essentially the 2 Doctors, because only 2 Doctors are in the same room, and the 5 Doctors only had 3 Doctors. Very funny how that works out. Incredible. He also worked on 2 stage plays, Doctor Who and the Daleks in the 7 Keys to Doomsday, which was out in 1974, and of course Doctor Who The Ultimate Adventure in 1989, which had Colin Baker and John Pertwee in the role of the Doctor. Sometimes John Pertwee would play it, sometimes Colin Baker would play it, which would have been very interesting to watch.
Yeah, sounds funky.
Between 1981 and 1988, Terry once again worked with producer Barry Letts as a script editor on 134 episodes of the classic serial, which serialized great literature such as Alice in Wonderland, Oliver Twist, and The Invisible Man. Barry Letts left the series in 1985 and gave a position of producer to Terrance Dicks, who went on to be producer until 1988, which is, 134 episodes, which is, he's a busy man.
Yeah, that is a lot of episodes. That is he's a busy boy indeed.
And during this time, he also was heavily involved still with the Whoniverse, writing 67 Target novelizations between 1974 and 1990.
Jesus
and he was
Christ.
He was also the unofficial editor of the range, so 67 books in about 16 years.
That's an incredible amount of books. My Christ.
And his name would be attached to like a lot of people's memories about Doctor Who, because during this time, obviously, there were no videotapes of existing stories, so instead we would have to go to bookshelves and, where's Terrance Dicks' name right in front of the cover? So he's probably associated with a lot of childhood memories of Doctor Who. Once Target dissolves were arranged, he began working for Virgin Books, although a bit more sporadically, as he was creating new stories instead of adapting previous stories. He wound up writing stories with the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Doctor. So he wrote for a lot of Doctors.
This is a man that really enjoyed writing Doctor Who.
He even wrote the first 8th Doctor book, which was set straight after the film. Basically, straight after the film, the Doctor's finally reading that book he wanted to read, The Time Traveller. Yeah. And he winds up in 1997, Totter's Lane, and he gets caught up between a conflict between a drug lord and a woman, and he winds up being imprisoned because he possesses drugs.
Right. Okay.
That's a Terrance Dicks book starring the 8th Doctor. It sounds like an odd story.
It sounds funky.
He would later write a couple of 10th Doctor novels with BBC Books in 2007. He would write one with Martha Jones, Meeting the Jadoon Again, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. And also, while writing all his books and writing all his episodes of TV, he also found time to write 140 of his own novels between 1974 and 2003.
My God.
Most of these being like children novels, but still, Jesus Christ.
That's almost like Stephen King levels of writing out books, isn't it? That's insane.
Yeah, he had an insane workload. Like, just so many books and so many episodes of TV. Just I can't imagine doing that.
No, that's a lot of writing all the time.
Some of his other works include a few direct-to-video Doctor Who spin-offs in the 90s with Shakedown, Return of Sontarans, and Mind Game. He also wrote the first episode of a Sarah Jane Smith spin-off in 2002 from Big Finish.
Oh.
He retired in the late 2000s, although he still liked to write the occasional story, with his final Doctor Who short story being published in October 2019, just a few months after he passed away at the age of 84.
Damn.
But his final short story was, funnily enough, set in between episodes of the War Games, which was his first ever story. So it comes full circle.
That's
and he
nice.
also confirms... In that short story, he also confirms his Season 6B theory, which is very interesting. We'll talk about it a bit more later on.
Ooh, teaser.
But yeah, that's Terrance Dicks for you. And this episode, the idea of bringing the three Doctors together was bound to pressure, according to Barry Letts, who was the producer. He said there was hardly a week that went by without people suggesting this idea. Terrance Dicks and Barry Letts constantly refused to do this. They thought the idea was as stupid as having the Daleks and Cybermen fight each other. I mean, also, they kind of ran out of ideas. They wanted to do gimmicks at the opening of every season. And they were like, yeah, it's the 10th season. It's the perfect time to introduce a multi-Doctor storyline. And it obviously stuck around because every anniversary now you expect a multi-Doctor storyline.
Yeah, and they are always fun. You know, we've heard a lot of for and against multi-Doctor storylines very recently with, the build-up to the 60th anniversary. Most famously, Eccleston being very much against multi-Doctor stories. But I've always got a soft spot for a multi-Doctor story. It just kind of makes me happy to see, oh, look, it's my favorite Doctors, and they're, like, poking fun at each other. This is nice.
Yeah, it's extreme fan service, but it's also just so much fun to watch. It's good fan service.
Yeah. Silly, inconsequential fun.
So they couldn't commission the script until they knew the two other actors were available, because obviously they still had John Pertwee in the role. Barry Letts' first call was to Patrick. I almost called him Patrick Stewart for some reason. His first call was to Patrick Troughton, who he had known since they co-starred in a live BBC production in which Patrick played Guy Fawkes and Barry played a conspirator. Patrick said he'd be delighted to do it, which came as a surprise because Patrick publicly stated he had a fear of being typecast in the role and wouldn't want to come back. So yeah, 3 years later, he's back on board, which is very interesting.
Sometimes you just need that break, I guess,
And of course, Patrick Troughton would go on to make two more guest appearances in 1983 and 1985, which one of them we're covering next year in June.
Very fun.
I'm very excited to watch two Doctors. Then Barry Letts phoned Hartnell, and Hartnell thought it was a lovely idea, despite saying the year prior that he disliked the path that Doctor Who took, as it was no longer a program for children.
Yeah.
We discussed his feelings about how dark Doctor Who became during the 10th Planet podcast last month.
Yes.
That's part of the reason why he kind of left, but mostly due to the ill health, but also he was just became difficult to work with, and he was like, I don't want Doctor Who to be this dark.
Yeah. We talked about this on the 10th Planet episode as well, where everybody involved in the show at that point was completely different than when Hartnell had started the show, and it just naturally evolved into something, and he was just kind of like this leftover from the past fucking like guard that were in charge, and it made sense for him to leave when he did. The show got better after he left.
It did, yes. I think it did, yes, because his era is fun to watch, but also very different.
It's very different. Yeah, it's very different from every other era.
So yeah, they commissioned Bob Baker and Dave Martin to write a story where a threat was so grave that it causes the three Doctors to unite. The duo started by incorporating their pitch into an idea they were working on independently. The original idea was called Death World and took place outside time in Hades, where the King of the Time Lords chooses the three Doctors to take part in a trial where they are fighting for control of the universe. Against the minions of death itself. The entrance to the world would be a graveyard. The trial element was accepted, but the graveyard element was dropped for obvious reasons. Way too dark for a kids program on BBC One.
That's a ridiculously high concept idea as well.
Yeah, you could imagine that on like a film level production.
Yeah, like it's a wild idea.
Doctor Who was made on the budget of like a bag of cheese and onion crisps. So yeah, Baker and Martin already knew Hartnell was ill, so they wrote the first Doctor with Hartnell's limited mobility in mind. Basically, if Hartnell would have been just sitting around with TARDIS, and he'd do a big thing at the end of episode 4, apparently. But, so months went by, and Bob Baker and Dave Martin had just finished writing the story, and Barry Letts was preparing the contracts, until Heather Hartnell phoned Barry and said that there was no possible way that William could do it, as he was terribly ill. Let's see if I can pronounce this. He had arteriosclerosis and wouldn't be able to remember his lines because the disease closes up the flow of blood to the limbs and the brain.
Oh, damn.
So yeah, there were days that William Hartnell couldn't even remember what Doctor Who was. Like, it was so important to him, he just couldn't remember what the show was. He basically had dementia, so...
Yeah, that's really tragic. Yeah.
Very tragic. And obviously on the day when Barry Letts phoned him, it was obviously a good day for him because he could remember exactly what Doctor Who was, and he was all up for doing it without realising he was obviously in poor health. Baker and Martin had moved on to other projects, so Terrance Dicks had to reduce the role even more by cutting out the final sequence where the first Doctor joins forces with the other two Doctors. To promote this episode, the Radio Times featured all 3 Doctors in the front cover, making it the only time the 3 actors appeared together in person. They shot this iconic cover in Hartnell's shed.
Oh, nice.
So they did get to meet William Hartnell in the end, but only in his shed, basically, because obviously he couldn't really do much outside of his house.
Yeah.
So... yeah, you want to jump into the episode then?
Yeah, sure.
On that very sad note.
Very, very sad note. Let's jump into a very silly episode as we look at part 1 of the 3 Doctors.
Well, it's a bit difficult to explain, Joe.
He's not one of them, is he?
Well, not so much one of them as one of us. One of me, to be precise.
Oh, no. I'm sorry, my dear. I hate to be contrary, but I can see he's a little bit confused, poor old chap, and I do feel you should have the correct explanation. You don't mind, do you?
Yes.
I didn't think you would. You see, Joe, I may call you Joe meantime. You see, he is one of me.
Oh, I see. You're both Time Lords.
Well, quite. Well, not quite.
Oh.
Not just Time Lords. We're the same Time Lord.
Now, please, you're only confusing my assistant. Joe, it's all quite simple. I am he, and he is me.
And we are all together, Goo Goo Kichu?
Mm-hmm. What?
It's a song by the Beatles.
How does it go?
Oh, please be quiet.
Look, is he really you?
Yes, I'm afraid so.
I think he is, Miss Grant. You see, when the Brig and I first met the Doctor, he looked like him.
How?
Yeah, that's what I'd like to know. You've got no right to be here.
Perhaps...
What about the first law of time?
Perhaps I could explain.
Perhaps you could.
Well, our fellow Time Lords out there are just as much under siege as we are.
What?
And they couldn't send anyone to help you. But they did summon up enough temporal energy to lift me out of my bit of our time stream and pop me down here, into my own future, so to speak.
Why?
My dear fellow, you are being a bit dim, aren't you? Your effectiveness is now doubled.
Halved, more like.
No. There's no need to be ungracious.
So our episode begins with an action-packed opening where for, it feels like a solid 5 minutes or so, we're just kind of looking at British landscape, but it's like a car's driving through a sleepy village, like a guy's out by a lake looking at a big balloon, and really nothing's going on and no one's talking and there's no music. It's an interesting way to open up the season.
If this was the Sea Devils, you just hear music as the car is driving along. Yeah. What noise would a car make if it was music?
Pew, 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 pew. That's the music the Sea Devils composer would use. It would sound like a gun for some reason.
But this was part of the reason why I was just so disappointed watching this episode the first time as a kid. Like, you think of it, all the Doctors being together at that point, and it's like, oh, this is going to be so exciting. Mm-hmm. And then it just opens up on just cars driving
just
by.
Just a sleepy town. Yeah, just a sleepy wee town. But something is slightly amiss in the sleepy town, as the like guy with the shotgun, like farmer guy, ends up getting zapped by a slideshow transition. And he vanishes. And we're like, oh my god, where did he vanish off to? There was some sort of weird creature thing in this box thing that he was touching or something like that. And we then cut to Joe giving everybody cups of tea in the unit headquarters, which is an interesting thing for the companion to do to open a season.
Yeah, it's a terrible... Yeah, we just covered the 10th planet last month, and I think there's a point where
There's
Polly
a point
makes tea.
where she gets told to make tea, and she goes... like...
It's so, and I think there was a point in the Tomb of the Cybermen where somebody makes tea. It's just like, can we not think of anything for the woman to do? Could we just...
Someone's got to make the tea, okay?
Could a man not make tea?
You get out of here with your hippie ideas. But this leads to quite a long discussion with the Doctor, Joe, the Brigadier, and some science guy, as they're all sipping on their tea, talking in a very British way, in a very boring, dry way, about like weather charts and like balloons and shit like that. And it's fantastic. What I love about Classic Who at times is how just overtly British it is. And, you know, people standing around having a boring conversation as they drink tea is just the pinnacle of British entertainment. But there is a few things I do really like about this scene. I like bits where, like, Pertwee is going off saying some science stuff. Joe understands what she's saying and translates that for like the Lethbridge Stewart and stuff. You know, like she's actually contributing to the conversation and being smart. Like,
yeah, she's able to explain it in an earthly way.
Cause
Brigadier, if there's one thing in this episode, Brigadier is very stupid in this episode.
He is. He's like a clown. He is the punching bag for the jokes quite often in this episode.
And there's even a point where the scientist shows the notes to the Brigadier, and he's like, "No, I'm stupid. You show that to the
show
doctor."
That to the doctor. I don't know what's going on. I can't read. There's a really nice bit of blocking as well when the Doctor's looking at these like X-rays of clouds, whatever the fuck. It's not an X-ray of a cloud. That's impossible. But that's what it looks like. And you know, one of them is really big and see-through, and then the most recent one is very thin and narrow, and he holds them up to the lens of the camera each time, and you can see his face through them. It's just a clever bit of illustrating how much it is without having to do much camera movement. I really, really liked that bit of blocking for sure.
One of my favorite things about this scene is John Pertwee's outfit. That coat is beautiful, and on the Blu-ray, just the color of the red pops, and it looks really nice. It looks really, really nice.
Nice, it does. I do like his costume. It is very frilly, although I also like the use of bow ties. You know, both him and the Second Doctor have bow ties on. Although when the Second Doctor does show up, it being in color, I don't know why. We've covered Second Doctor stories before. But it being in color really, to me, just yelled how much Matt Smith's costume was inspiration from the Second Doctor, because it is almost like note for note the same costume as Matt Smith's. It's just like the trousers on the Second Doctor are very much old man trousers that go up to like his nipples. Like...
One of my favorite things about this scene also is just like the Brigadier's like, "Can I do something that's useful?" And the Doctor's like, "Yeah, sure, pass me this rod."
Yes.
And it goes along the line of people, and the Doctor just stirs his tea with it. It's wonderful.
It is. The Doctor and Joe then are like, "Hey, we've got to go investigate this other anomaly or something." They have to go somewhere, and they're going to leave Science Guy to continue researching and say that he should have all the stuff he needs in this room, which then leads to like a jab from the Brigadier once they leave, when he's like, "You know, this is a top secret facility, Mr. Science Guy. You shouldn't be making yourself so at home." But like, why the fuck is he there if he's like shouldn't be making himself at home? Who is this man? Why did you invite him to your top secret facility if you're just going to tell him, by the way? Like,
you know, the thing about Unit is it never makes any sense, no matter how many times you see Unit in the show. Like, you think Unit nowadays doesn't make sense? Like in the classic series, they always seem to change location. They always seem to change whether or not it's a secret organization, because there's like the Brigadier's like, "Oh yeah, this is a secret organization," and then later on there's a sign saying Unit just outside the door. It's just like, how secret is this?
It doesn't just say Unit, it says Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart on the sign as well. He's just advertising his name outside the building for some reason. But Science Guy prints off like an X-ray of some more storm stuff with a human face on it, and it looks very, very silly. It is very silly. But this face, it turns out, we find out later, is like his face or something, because he gets zapped.
No,
is it somebody else's face?
It's the face of the farmer who got zapped earlier.
Right.
Because he's already in wherever he is.
He's in like the deserty place that we see later. But the Science Guy is very confused by that, and then he gets zapped by the PowerPoint transition as well, because there was an alien creature thing in that orange box or something. It zaps him and then crawls into the sink, and it definitely looks flawless. Doesn't look really jank at all. It is some very good digital effects.
Yeah, it's a very digital effect.
It's a very early.
Like it looks pixelated, it looks glitchy, it looks. I'm not sure how to describe it. It's very strange, but I kind of dig it. I dig it more than the actual costumes for the blobby creatures.
I really like the blobby creatures, honestly. I really like them. But we then cut to the Doctor and Joe as they're at the site where the farmer guy vanished, and they're chatting with an old lady. And honestly, I didn't remember this scene happening. It's very inconsequential. It's just like, oh, things are kind of weird here, aren't they? Interesting.
Yeah, it's like the Doctor uses his sonic screwdriver, which sounds like a Geiger counter throughout this entire story for some reason.
Yeah, it's strange.
But he's just basically like, there's no sign of her husband. Her husband was probably kidnapped somehow, and we can't. It's more important than we thought. It's big. It's
something's
like,
afoot. Yeah. We then get a very nice little bit of comedy with Lethbridge Stewart again as he comes back to the bit looking for the science man, and he's like, "Oh, he's not here. Okay, great. Let's call the guards. He's gone off for a fucking wander around this facility." Obviously because he's not, and he's actually just been zapped.
This is obviously the reintroduction of Benton, who was a regular during the unit years. John Levine was originally started as a Cyberman in Yetis. Like, his height was he was a very tall man, so he was obviously cast as a lot of monsters for the role. And eventually, when in the Patrick Troughton era unit were introduced, they were like, "We need a tall soldier. Let's cast John Levine." And he eventually became a regular because obviously the third Doctor era was more about Unit, and Unit was a family. In this episode, he's given more lines than normal because the man who played Mike Yates, who we saw in The Demons, was working on stage, and later he'll take on a role Jamie was supposed to take. But Fraser Hines was busy filming Emmerdale and he couldn't do it. So in this episode, he has more lines than normal. So according to him, John Levine, he was very scared he was going to let the other actors down, and this is him talking, because I hadn't been to drama school or anything, and I had no voice lessons or anything like that, but Patrick Troughton said to me, "Don't worry about the amount of dialogue, John, he won't have any trouble with it. You've done a marvellous job on Benton, and I love acting opposite you." And this was
nice.
the kind of faith he had to just carry on the episode, which is really lovely to hear stories about this, because Patrick Troughton seems like a nice guy when he's in work mode. his personal life, not so much, but his work mode life. Yeah,
I don't know too much about Patrick Troughton's personal life.
Basically, he led a hidden secret life throughout his entire life. He had a secret family he kept from his real family. So
wow,
that's from what I've heard, and it sounds like a weird life.
Interesting. What an interesting man. We then cut to the Doctor driving Bessie, which doesn't have a roof, and so Joe has to use an umbrella as a roof, and it's very silly to look at as they're driving through this
that's a good point, actually. What happened to the roof?
No idea. It's just this quite wet day, and they're like, we'll just use an umbrella, it's fine. But they park up the car and get out, and then immediately they get attacked by this monster thing, and it is hilarious. Where the Doctor's like, you got to run back over the car, Joe, fucking run when I say run. And it's silly. And then Bessie ends up getting destroyed, which is... it doesn't really get destroyed, it gets sucked away. Whenever the PowerPoint transition happened, I was like, God, I don't care about this. But
as a kid, Bessie has been a big part of a show for like 3 years, and you think, oh no, Bessie's gone. Bessie was basically the TARDIS for the Doctor for a while, because obviously he couldn't have his TARDIS.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yes. There's also minor wardrobe malfunction in this scene, which is shame, really. When Joe runs across the car, it is just Pant City. You know, you're looking
Oh,
all the
I
way
never
to
even noticed
you're looking
that.
all the way to France. Like, but
I'm not surprised, though.
yeah. There's a really fun bit of blocking with the Doctor and Joe where they're like peeking out from a tree. Like, it's very cartoony where the tree's in the middle, the Doctor's on one side, Joe's on the other, as they're like, oh my god, what's going on here? We should run. You know, it's just, I like the framing. It's very nice. Every now and then, Doctor Who pulls out some creative little frames.
Yeah, on for this budget, it does have some nice little images, you know. Like, you know, this was shot in such limited amount of time. I think this was shot in November and the episode came out in December, so obviously it was a rushed production. And it turns out decent enough
It does,
for the
yeah.
most part.
It's
Question mark.
completely fine. It's completely fine. But the Doctor and Joe end up back at the science facility where they're talking with Lethbridge Stewart and the other guy whose name I have definitely forgotten already. Benton. And this is where the Doctor's kind of figuring out that there's something afoot, that the thing is going after him and not other people, because, you know, it attacked the science guy in the science facility, attacked him at the car, you know, these are all, like, places where he was, and the thing just missed him. It seems to be going after him. He comes to this conclusion really quickly, but I guess he's a smart guy, and there's a lot more stuff going on in this episode, so I'm not that fussed about it, honestly.
I thank God he comes to this conclusion quickly, because I really want to get to the second Doctor, and
Yeah.
technically the first Doctor shows up, technically.
Yeah, technically. It's weird that we're now at the, like, halfway point of this episode. Believe it or not, we are halfway through this episode, and nothing so much has happened. It's been a really slow setup, and it's really strange thinking in these next 13 minutes we're going to get the second Doctor to show up, we're going to go to Gallifrey, we're going to, like, see, like, you know, we're going to see the first Doctor, there's going to be, like, all this shit suddenly just starts happening in these last 10 minutes, like...
Yeah, classic Doctor Who goes at a weird pace sometimes.
It really does. It really does.
But, you know, the most interesting stuff at the very front, you know.
Yeah, the quiet little sleepy village. Yeah. So the episode continues with a extremely long and drawn out gunfight between unit soldiers and several Mr. Blobbies that spontaneously pop into existence.
Yeah, so in the script, these blobby creatures were supposed to, like, keep on changing shapes, but I don't think Bob Baker and Dave Martin knew what show they were writing for. Because, you know, Doctor Who would never have that budget back in the 70s, and instead they're just kind of just solid form, and it's very hard to explain. It's very strange.
It is. They're just these big blobby guys with a big eyeball. It's like, I liken them to, like, Power Ranger villains. Like, they look like they should be fighting the Power Rangers. They are that rubbery.
They also have, like, a glowing lobster claw.
Yeah.
And every time we cut to the lobster claw, you can see the fight is in a grassy area, but every time we cut to the close up of the claw, you can see, like, sand. That's because it was shot on another day when everybody's at the, like, you know, the quarry later on in the episode 2. Yes. So yeah, it's very weird contrasts between the grass and the sand.
Very strange indeed. The Lethbridge goes off to go help with the fighting as the Doctor and Joe are left alone in the science place. The Doctor tells Joe basically to fuck off because he's in danger and she's not. She's like, absolutely not. Benton climbs in through the window.
He tells her to fuck off because she's a girl and she might scream.
Yeah. Benton climbs in through the window as the magical goo stuff comes in through the vent and starts attacking them, forcing them to run inside the TARDIS and hide, which what I really like here is the Doctor turns on, like, the force field and stuff like that. There's a gunfire going on out around him, people are dying everywhere, and Joe, he calls out, like, a signal to the Time Lords and stuff to be like, oh, come help us, and Joe's like, so what are we gonna do? And he's like, well, we're safe in here, so we'll just kick our feet up and watch it on the TV. Like...
Yes, well, this is actually a new TARDIS interior for the time. What do you think of the TARDIS?
It's fine. I don't think this is my favorite classic Who TARDIS, but it's completely fine. It feels like a lot of empty space.
It does. Every TARDIS feels like empty space because they just don't know how to fill up the space, really.
Yeah.
This new TARDIS cost £89 for 125 hours of work, which is roughly £950 in today's money. So yeah, we can build like
That's
a
still cheap.
lot of these.
That's still cheap. Yeah, that's doable. Like,
It's amazing how cheap these TARDISes is. Whereas we just found out a new Doctor Who's doing a new deal with Disney, and this TARDIS is gonna look amazing. Imagine all the money being spent on that TARDIS design. That's going to look incredible.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very cool.
I am excited to see the new TARDIS.
Yes, I'm always excited to see the new TARDIS. It's always a bit of excitement for me. But the Doctor calls out a warning, or like a SOS to the Time Lords, and we then transition to presumably Gallifrey, with some Time Lords in a very colorful set. It is, they love their color, the Time Lords.
Yeah, this was the second time in the show we've ever seen Gallifrey, and it wasn't named at the time. The last time we saw Gallifrey was, of course, at the end of the War Games. This is the last time we would actually see them in the way Malcolm Hulke and Terrence Dick made them, as like a scientific race dedicated to keeping the universe balanced. The next time we see the Time Lords in a major way would be the Deadly Assassin, which took place after the Hand of Fear, and they were basically they were rewritten into being like big politicians.
Yes,
they were just focused on politics. And this was controversial at the time because they changed the Time Lords. And cut forward to like 40 years later with all the Timeless Children stuff.
And they've been...
every time they tried to add new lore to the Time Lords, it's been controversial. Even when they were destroyed in the Time War, that was a controversial move as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. They never seem to quite nail the Time Lord. The Time Lords themselves have always interested me, and I've always wanted to explore Gallifrey loads. And it just feels like they always end up either making them really dull, boring, or just don't know what to do and kill them off.
Apparently, the Big Finish spin-off Gallifrey, which has like legacy characters like Romana and Leela, apparently that's a really interesting Big Finish spin-off. But there's like 20,000 box sets.
Yeah, it's Big Finish.
In terms of the actors playing the Time Lords, the bearded Time Lord Sittin was played by disabled actor Graham Lehman, and he appeared in other minor roles throughout series and 5 stories, which is cool. We're casting a disabled actor. It's something you wouldn't think about seeing in Doctor Who in the 70s.
Yeah, absolutely.
The actor who plays the Chancellor reprises his role from the War Games, so that's a nice little bit of continuity. And also, they look up images of a black hole, which looks nothing like a black hole.
It doesn't look like a black hole at all. But they also go on to have an extremely long conversation about the ethicality of crossing the time streams with the Doctor, and if it's with the rules or against the rules, and whether or not they'll be able to afford to use that much power because they're currently like trapped with some time thing to do with the black hole as well. It's very convoluted, but I did love it. I thought it was fantastic with how just really dull and dry sci-fi it was.
And every time we've had like a multi-Doctor storyline after this, it's never really like, we never sit around pondering the ethicality of having 2 Doctors in the same room. We kind of mention it briefly in like Day of the Doctor and stuff, but it's never a big part of the plot in this way.
Yeah, it's just like an abnormality's happened and you won't remember this, but we need your help right now, so come on. Like,
a fun concept would be, what if something went seriously wrong when 2 Doctors crossed paths?
Yeah.
Like, that kind of is kind of what happened in Father's Day, kind of.
Yeah.
When the 9th Doctor ran into himself.
It got.
Yeah. So this whole situation with the black holes in this episode, Bob and Dave got information about black holes from an astronomer after being inspired from an article on the subject in the Times in 1972. Basically, what you need to know about Bob and Dave is they know nothing about science, and several times throughout this entire story, they basically copy and paste lines from his Times article and give it to the Doctor so he can explain what a black hole is. But this was basically lifted from the Times.
Incredible.
Like, it's exact lines. We know nothing about science, which is funny, really funny.
That is very funny. They decide, the Time Lords, that they're going to get the second Doctor to come back and help the first Doctor, the third Doctor. And we cut to the TARDIS as we start hearing this whirling noise as if the TARDIS is transporting or moving somewhere. We see the second Doctor's recorder appear on top of the console, and the Doctor's like, this seems familiar to me, gives it to Joe, and Joe's like, oh, I don't know. And then there's a really nice effect shot. It's very, very obvious how they did it, but I really like this effect shot where the second Doctor's hand appears out of nowhere and grabs the recorder, and then bang, his entire body appears after that. I thought that was a lot of fun. And then after the second Doctor shows up, oh my fuck, does this episode become amazing, because he is just comedy out his ass in every line.
So there was an issue, a little tension on set between Patrick and John, obviously. Basically, Patrick liked ad-libbing while John preferred to say the lines as written, and he relied on verbal cues from other actors. So if a sentence ended up with the word bed, for example, John Pertwee would know to go with his next line. But if Patrick Troughton said another word instead, he'd be like, oh, it's my line now. Like, that caused a little tension, because obviously there's two different acting styles there. And you can see where John's coming from. And obviously a lot of tension at first, but eventually the two would become close friends. And they still enjoyed the act of bickering at fan conventions and TV appearances. Like, if you ever see footage of these two men together, they are always bickering, and it's always entertaining, like this episode.
This episode, it does become, for these last 5 minutes, just ridiculously entertaining. There's some incredible jokes with the second Doctor just being this annoying little twerp with his, like, recorder. There's a great bit where they're trying to explain how, like, the second Doctor, who he is to Joe, and Joe's like makes a joke about the Beatles, and the second Doctor's like, oh, how does it go? And the recording it's so good. It's so,
and of course,
so
Patrick
good.
Troughton has the line of "You've redecorated," which comes up quite often. But Patrick Troughton came up with "I don't like it," so that's his line.
It is,
and he says it again in the Five Doctors when he visits the Brigadier in his new office.
And also famously recreated again when David Tennant visits into, I think it's Matt Smith's TARDIS. And he's like, you've redecorated. Oh, I don't like it.
And then also, Matt Smith says it when he runs into James Corden again.
Yes.
About his house.
Yes.
There's also a little nice bit of continuity between Benton and the second Doctor, where they're like, remember the time with Sidemen and the Yetis? And, last time I saw you were a sergeant, now you're corporal or whatever. There's some good...
Last time I saw you were a corporal, now you're a sergeant.
Yeah.
It's very, very fun. But the third Doctor and the second Doctor cannot stop their bickering, and the Time Lords look on like, oh fuck. Well, we'll go and get the first Doctor to come and tell them off then, I guess. But something goes awry, and the first Doctor ends up on a boat on their TV screen, and he's like, I'm here to tell you that it's a time bridge, okay? And then he just kind of leaves. It's a weird scene.
Yeah.
But I did like how it was shot. I thought it was shot very cleverly, because it gets this close up on the TV screen, and on the TV you see the reflection of everybody watching the screen. I thought that was a very, very fun little bit of camera work.
Yeah, which later on causes problems because you can see the camera in multiple shots in like episode 3 and 4. So, but before we get William Hartnell on the screen in the TARDIS, we see him in a garden. That's actually William Hartnell's garden.
Oh,
and
nice.
This was the last bit of work last bit of acting William Hartnell ever did, just walking around in his garden, which is kind of sad.
Yeah, but at least he's still got to keep doing it until he couldn't anymore.
Yeah, but obviously all of Hartnell's scenes were pre-filmed at Alien Studios, and he was looking at the teleprompter the entire time, just reading cards, because obviously he couldn't remember any lines.
Yeah.
What changed? What changed from... he could never remember any lines anyway.
He was terrible at remembering lines, but it does lead to this awkward, and it's, there's nothing you can do because he is a dying man. It does lead to this awkward stiltness in his performance, and this awkward beats where, like, they'll say something, and then there's, like, a 5-second pause, and Hartnell will be like, yes, and then say his line, but you get past it,
Yeah, there's an awkward beat where Patrick Troughton's just looking at the screen, kind of waiting for William Hartnell to say a line. He's just like, go on. Yeah.
What I did really like is I like the inherent comedy that the smartest, wisest doctor that needs to calm down the other two doctors is technically the youngest doctor.
Yeah.
That,
Which is, again, what Stephen Moffat did in The Day of the Doctor, where
Yes.
John Hurt's doctor is the most sensible out of the two doctors. and he's just so upset about what he's become. He's like, am I having a midlife crisis, if you remember that line?
yes, it's very good. There's
also
a line...
in this episode, Joe was originally given a really weird line of, it's like two women in one kitchen.
Oh, wow.
Basically referring to the doctor's bickering, which is, I'm glad that was cut.
Yeah, though speaking of weird, definitely dated lines, Hartnell has a line when he's looking at the two doctors, and he's like, these are my replacements. It's like, what does he say? Something and a clown.
Dandy and a clown.
Yeah, a dandy and a clown. And just the word dandy to me feels a little bit like, okay, what do you mean by that? What exactly are you hitting at with that word? Like,
What do they mean by that?
I don't know. But it's a very old timey word, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like very 1970s. What else happens? So they end up getting shouted at by Hartnell one more time, where he doesn't really say anything. And then the doctor, for some reason, is like, fuck this, I'm going to go kill myself. And leaves the TARDIS. This is John Pertwee. He leaves the TARDIS to go confront the Beast, and Joe runs after him, and he's like, no, Joe, stop. And then they both get zapped by the PowerPoint transition, which means that now our doctors are separated and no longer having fun together.
It was a really strange decision to have them interact for like 4 minutes in one episode, and then suddenly the next episode they're separated.
It's just separate adventures. Yeah, it's very strange because they were so charming together as well for those 4 minutes. It's wonderful. I was like, I want the whole episode to be this, but then they're like, fuck that.
But at least next episode, the second Doctor does get some great stuff to do with the Brigadier, which we'll cover obviously in a few minutes.
Yes, in a few minutes indeed. But that does bring us to the end of episode 1. What are your thoughts on this? Just brief thoughts on this first episode before we move into part 2.
I enjoyed it overall. It's just a fun episode. There's just so many silly moments which aren't intentional, which I just find myself giggling away at it.
Yeah, I found it pretty funny as well. I think it definitely gets better in the second half than it does in the first half. The first half to me feels like a very slow build-up, whereas the second half flies by because you have this fun banter. It's not really something that super continues into the next episode. The next episode is still fun, but we'll see. But this one I did have an enjoyable time with. But with that said, let's jump in to episode 2.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes.
Yes, but you're not the...
Yes, it is, sir. It's the first one.
How are you, Brigadier?
Pretty well, thanks. Doctor, what the blazes are you doing? Why have you changed your appearance? And what's happened to Miss Grant?
There you are. It's all quite simple, really.
Yes, but I'm sorry. Well, I don't believe a word of it. Look, just tell me this. Are you or are you not the doctor that I met during the Yeti business? And then later, when the Cybermen invaded?
Of course I am. You can see that.
Right, but then you subsequently appeared on Earth during that trouble with the Autons, only then you changed into a tall, thin fellow.
Had I really? How fascinating.
Doctor, I warn you.
It's no use your asking me about all this, Brigadier. As far as I'm concerned, it hasn't happened yet. Don't you see? I'm just a temporal anomaly.
Episode 2 begins as all episodes 2s of Classic Who's do's, which is right where the first episode ended, with the Doctor being zapped into oblivion with Joe at his side. However, this time we stay with the second Doctor, as he is like, yeah, I'm sure they knew what they were doing. We've just got to kind of focus on the problem at hand and ignore whatever the hell they're up to. Because, quite frankly, there's nothing we can do about it. Which is, fair enough.
This episode more than most feels like a classic second Doctor episode of Doctor Who, because obviously he's been separated and he's stuck with a unit gang, which is two characters he's spent a lot of time with in this era.
Yeah. They step out of the TARDIS and they look at the orb, the blobby thing, and it is just kind of sitting there. It jolts for a bit, and they run into the TARDIS and then come back out for some lighthearted comedy. But basically, they're like, oh, it's got its prey, it's got the Doctor, so now it's just kind of waiting to find out what it has to do next. So we've got some time to sit around and fucking chat shit.
Yeah, on chat shit they do.
Oh my god, they sure do. We get a really fun bit that it starts like freaking out a little bit again, but the Brigadier shows up and they all run out to tell the Brigadier to like, hey, fucking stop what you're doing. And there's this great like moment with the Brigadier where he like he slowly turns his head to the second Doctor and he's like, what the ever living shit, how are you here, like, why have you changed your face again to this guy, Doctor, like, what's going on? The Brigadier comedy is top notch. Like, and
also the Brigadier kind of predicts degeneration. You know, the idea that the Doctor could go back to the previous form.
Yeah.
But you know, that's never going to happen in the show. The next Doctor would never be someone we've seen before.
Completely.
Right?
Yeah, sure, definitely.
But yeah, the Brigadier just doesn't believe the fact that, you know, the second Doctor time traveled into the present.
I know. Even though he's got a time machine. The Brigadier's like, hey, what's been happening since I've been gone? And the Doctor's like, oh, it's okay, I'll catch you up on everything. So John Pertwee got zapped. Then we cut to a shot that's like 1 second long of John Pertwee and Joe appearing in the quarry. Then we cut back to the second Doctor being like, and that's everything that happens, because it's supposed to be like a time skip, so we're not just repeating information.
Yeah.
But it's like he told all that information in 1.5 seconds. Like it's they do not give enough time to make it feel like a time skip.
It's not that hard of a story to explain. Basically, the Doctor and Joe got zapped, and they called for me to help, and now I'm here. But yeah, but the fact that the Brigadier just does not believe the fact that he's the second Doctor, he's from the past, is so funny. There was a line in the script which says, where the second Doctor says, "Believe what you'd like, Brigadier, as long as it makes you happy." which I wish was kept here, because we basically just go with his. We basically go with him. Basically being like, yeah, I'm from the. I changed my face. Okay, Brigadier. I just love the fact that the Brigadier is just a massive idiot in this episode.
Yeah, he's a complete buffoon. But the Doctor explains that what they're facing is like antimatter, and you know that's super complicated, and the only people that are able to stop it are me and me and me. He said, which is a very, very fun line. And we then cut to the Time Lords for some really boring shit that does not matter, where they are just recapping what happened in episode 1, where they're like, you know, this is where everybody is, this is what's going on, this is who we are, this is, you know, the third Doctor's over here, the second Doctor's over here, and we're still trapped with the time travel fucking black hole thing. Like, it's very much like, if you missed last week's episode here, this will catch you up as we continue going.
Yeah, they cut away from Patrick Troughton delivering exposition just so they can deliver it from the Time Lords, who are infinitely more boring. Just have Patrick Troughton explain it. He's a charming, funny man. Just have him explain it. It'd be so much more entertaining.
It would be, but instead we get a very long scene with the Time Lords. Eventually we cut to John Pertwee in a quarry with Joe, and Joe's immediate reaction is, oh, we're died, didn't we? We are dead. We're gone. This is it. We're in hell. Which is an attitude I really like for a companion to have. It's very fun.
Also, I just love the fact that she thinks the quarry is hell, because like every fucking classic Who story is set in a quarry. It's great.
They start walking around as we see one of the Mr. Blobby creatures looking on at them from a distance. The quarry stuff for me doesn't really grip me. There's some fun moments in it, but it's very much just a quarry. They're walking around.
Yeah, basically, this whole scene is just like 5 minutes of them wandering around, and there's two moments where they are overwatched by the Blobby creature, and then there's another moment where they're overwatched by the farmer man. It's like, do you really need 3 moments of people watching them? Do you really need it?
You do. You need more, honestly, I thought. There was, we also get a good scene with the second Doctor where he's just giving more exposition, but he's talking about the antimatter and how it's like impossible for it to exist here, but yet it exists here anyway. And he's got some, you know, fun quips where he's like, yeah, it's pretty awkward, isn't it, that this thing's just here and we don't know why. Then, you know, it shouldn't be here, but whoever put it here is clearly more smarter than we are.
It's a fun line. Just basically like, yeah, whoever we need to figure this out because whoever's put this here is more smarter than we are, and that's the only problem.
Yeah. We go back to Joe and the doctor at the quarry, and they're looking at a bunch of shit that got zapped, mainly from the office, the science office. There's a very fun joke with the door being locked, and John Pertwee's like, well, it says no admittance on the door, even though you can get around the walls. Very, very, very fun comedy.
They also walk past a very highly advanced mini computer from way back in the 70s, which was high tech 50 years ago, which is kind of insane to look at now.
Yeah. They then find Bessie and basically decide to just fucking drive around for a bit and see what they see as they get looked on at by one of the Blobby guys, which is fun. I mean, like, if you're...
John Pertwee basically has a line of "where to," and Joe replies with, "Oh, just twice around the park, I guess."
Yeah. Speaking of being very British, but this does lead us into one of my favorite shots from this episode, which is this weird as fuck Dutch angle as the car is like parking up on one of the roads that make it look like they're like at a 45 degrees on a mountaintop. It's crazy looking.
I think the first time I watched that, I was like, "Holy shit!" They drove at that angle.
Yeah, like
the cameras.
It
took me a moment to realize.
It's fun, and it does add to this place seeming slightly more otherworldly. You know, like the landscape's all fucked, and they're not driving on like just a straight path.
I will say, Classic Who does a good job of making quarries feel otherworldly because, like, unless you're looking really hard, you don't see any like trees in the distance or just cars driving by. Most of these shots look pretty well done. Yeah.
We then cut back to the second Doctor as he set up some sort of device to use if the antimatter starts moving again. But the Brigadier comes back and says, you've got to have a video call with everybody that's in charge because they want to talk to you about what's going on. And the second Doctor's like, won't they be super confused as to why I'm me and not, the third Doctor? And the Brigadier's went, I just said you were his companion. It seemed a lot easier that way, which greatly upsets the second Doctor. This is some wonderful, wonderful comedy.
Yeah, some great comedy, and also the mention of the video phone was to reference the fact that the story takes place in the future decade of the 80s, where everybody will be on their video phones.
Yes, they will. God,
could you imagine video phones being made?
No,
that'd be insane.
I honestly can't imagine living in the futuristic year of 1980s. It seems so far away that I don't think we'll ever get to see it.
Could you just imagine just talking to somebody over the phone, but you actually see them, and you're looking at like a little camera? That'd be insane.
What you're talking about makes literally no sense. But the Doctor gives his device to Benton, and he's like, zap it if it moves, zap it more if it keeps moving. And then he leaves, and Benton starts like panicking, being like, oh shit, what if, like, I don't know what I'm going to do. This is pretty scary. Then the second everybody leaves, he's like, fuck this, and just shakes some chewing gum and like eats the gum and throws the wrapper into the antimatter, which pisses off the antimatter, and it starts like gurgling. He's like, oh fuck again, he turns on the zappy thing. But it's that sudden attitude change of, oh my god, I'm really nervous too. Fuck it.
I can just picture Dave Martin and Bob Baker being like, oh fuck, how do we advance the plot? Oh, I know, let's have Benton eating some gum.
Yeah, and he throws it in, and then it makes the thing go all gurgly for no reason.
Like, it's really the only way you could advance the plot at this point with the second Doctor storyline. Like,
yeah. But everybody,
it's so silly.
It starts moving, and he calls everybody back, and then they run into the TARDIS as the thing explodes away the electrical device that was doing literally nothing to it. It did not work at all. So with everybody inside the TARDIS, the Brigadier's mind kind of breaks because I guess this is his first time inside the actual TARDIS, and he's like, oh my god, it's bigger on the inside. It's kind of like what happened with Kate Stewart most recently in the Centenary special, where she had never been in the TARDIS before, and she's like, what the fuck?
Yeah, it's so funny that we're doing this episode straight after Power of the Doctor, because Power of the Doctor makes a big reference about the Doctor's flute or recorder, and of course the second Doctor's whole subplot here is basically he's trying to find his recorder. Yeah,
I mean, calling it a subplot is really being generous to it. He does,
no, I'm telling you, it becomes important in part 4.
He does, however, offer. Hang on, I'm gonna sneeze.
Bless you.
He does, however, offer the Brigadier a jelly baby, which is a fun reference to something that hasn't happened yet, which is some fun Doctor Who foreshadowing accidentally, probably.
So yeah, this is the second appearance of a jelly baby. Actually, the second Doctor first offered somebody a jelly baby in the Crotons, I want to say, in 1967. So yeah, this is the second reference. In the script, it was scripted as a gobstopper, but then we realized, yeah, we want to do a Tom Baker reference before Tom Baker
shows up. Yeah. We then cut to the science man in the quarry, and if you ever wondered if the writers knew anything about science, even though Scott said they didn't, they really show it here, where it opens with the science guy going E = mc squared, and so that must mean it is very funny.
I like to be meta with the scientist character. I think he realizes he's in a script written by two people who know nothing about science, and he's like a real scientist, and he's just going absolutely mad being in the script.
Right.
Like just writing E = mc squared in the sand, and later he tries to escape the whole situation. He just goes completely mad for the rest of these episodes.
He really does. But this is a very fun conversation with the Doctor, the scientist, and Joe, where the Doctor's like, we're in an impossible place, in an impossible world, and nothing should matter, and it shouldn't make sense, but it does. And the scientist is like, okay, cool, that makes no sense, but I guess we're living in a world where, like, nothing makes sense. And Joe's there the entire time, like, jaw slacked open, be like, huh? Oh, huh? Like, it's very funny. Like,
yeah, she's basically me throughout the whole thing. None of this makes any sense, but it's fun. It's silly. It's fun.
It's fun, silly sci-fi. But then we find out that they're getting watched by somebody mysterious. As a guy's like, oh my god, I finally caught a Time Lord, let's go collect him. And he's in like a giant Power Ranger costume with a big shiny glove. He looks very silly.
Yeah, we'll talk about him more next week.
Yeah.
But basically, the script says that Omega's screen should be like a magic mirror. But this is basically just a
TV,
23-inch color television with like cardboard cut around it. It looks really terrible.
They did their best, I'm sure. Sorry,
one thing about Omega before we move on. Do you recognize his voice? Because he's iconic to us in the show.
I do not. I'm bad at recognizing voices.
He is played by Stephen Thorne, who played Azal in The Demons, our favorite episode.
Yes, of course. That's an episode, one of the earliest episodes we ever covered on the podcast, and they are like 3.5 hours each, because we chatted a lot of shit back then.
I can't remember what we even talked about. I can't imagine filling up a whole 3.5 hour podcast. It makes no sense to me. How did we do it?
We were just chatting. I'm pretty sure we went on lots of tangents. But the Doctor, they get like shot at by a bunch of the Blobby guys, and they surrender. As we then cut back to the second Doctor, and he's like, "Fucking, I'm not going to open the door because we're all going to die. Also, have you seen my recorder? It's gone missing, and I need to think. I can only think when I'm listening to music." It's a very silly, pointless scene, but it's fun, I guess.
Yeah. One of my favorite bits is that Benton and the second Doctor just watching the blob outside on the television screen while the Brigadier is in the background completely having a panic attack, a midlife crisis. He's just going through all the motions of like, why the fuck am I in here? What's going on? What is this madhouse? Let me out. And the Doctor's just completely ignoring him.
He is. It's very funny. We cut very briefly to the John Pertwee and that inside the alien like palace, which is definitely not a set, definitely very much an alien palace. And they don't really talk about much of anything. They just basically explain where they are, and we cut away again. What you're going to notice now with these last remaining 7 minutes of the episode is that there's no more plot. And they are just fucking killing time at this point. And they overtly say on 2 different occasions, we're just wasting time right now, aren't we? Like,
yeah, both plots have characters saying, oh yeah, this is just a waste of time in the next 7 minutes. It's insane. It's like, but this basically the episode ran short, and they were like, we need to have a scene where the scientist guy tries to escape only to be caught by the end.
Yeah.
So that's the whole reason why he escapes, and also the whole scene inside of the TARDIS is just more padding. It's a lot of padding.
It is. It's rough. It's really rough.
In an episode that's already feels like It's just all padding.
There's no plot in this episode at all.
No.
There's really nothing going on.
You could easily just skip from part 1 to part 3 and just be like, okay, somehow they just got into the base of Omega, and that's all you really miss.
You could literally make it that they got zapped by the antimatter and it made them go into the palace.
Yeah.
Like,
what do you think of the palace, by the way?
I think it looks really silly. I think it is really, really silly.
It looks terrible. Basically, the week after the episodes aired, the Birmingham Post made a cartoon in which Santa Claus was found at the end of this corridor.
Right.
It just looks like a load of Christmas balls.
Yeah, I get that. That's funny. Yeah. But speaking of wasting time, the second Doctor is like taking batteries out of a remote for something as Benton comes over and is like, "You're wasting time right now," and he's like, "Yeah." We then cut to the scientist and he's like, "Hey, I'd really want to waste time right now if that seems cool with you. I just want to go off running around." And John Pertwee's like, "What the fuck are you talking about? That is a terrible decision to make. Why would you decide to just run around right now?" And then he goes, "Yeah, you're right," and then runs off anyway. It's hilarious.
You're in this like magical land where somehow there's these blobby creatures that can kill you, and you're just like, yeah, I'm just gonna run off now.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? Why?
But it gets better. He runs off and he gets chased and hunted down by the blobby guys as the Doctor and Joe are standing there talking like, "Oh God, I can't believe he ran off. Maybe he'll be in danger. Maybe he'll all right." Then he comes back. He comes back to them and he's like, "Wow, I shouldn't have run off. That was just kind of a waste of time, wasn't it?" Fucking ludicrous. It's insane. Like,
yeah, he runs around for like a solid minute and just comes back like a minute later, just like, yeah, I was. I
shouldn't have done that. That was a mistake. Whoops.
Like, there's not even any kind of tension or anything. Like, if this was like in any other episode, he could maybe become mind controlled or something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Something interesting could have happened to him.
Just nothing happens. Then we cut back to the second Doctor and they're wasting more time in the TARDIS until the first Doctor calls and he's like, "You need to lower the shields and go out and face this thing. Be smart." And then he fucks off again. And the Doctor's like, "Oh, well, I trust myself. And I said to lower the shields. I'm going to lower the shields." So he lowers the shields. And then we cut to a soldier outside fighting as all the blobbies disappear. And then suddenly the entire house disappears that they're in, the entire base. And it gets sucked into a black hole in a hilarious looking image as the episode suddenly comes to a conclusion out of nowhere. It's such an abrupt ending. It is not a good episode.
It's also a really bad jump cut because 1 minute the sun. This was shot in the winter, so the sun sets really fast, and the sun just is in completely different positions at both ends of the day. So it's like it's a really terrible jump cut. And also, there's a scene where John Pertwee basically explains to the scientist dude that this whole land is just magic, and he does a magic trick. That's actually John Pertwee doing a real life magic trick.
Oh, nice.
He could do magic tricks, and apparently Katie Manning still has those feather flowers in her house, which is lovely.
Oh, that is nice. But yeah, what did you think of episode 2?
When I was watching this, I still had loads of fun. I was still giggling away. But as you know, when you're watching it for a podcast, it's a different experience.
Yeah.
When you're just analyzing it.
Yeah.
And basically, part 2, nothing happens. There's no. Part 2 is just like, oh yeah, it's just padding. There's nothing happening here. It's not interesting at all.
Just constant padding. It is not interesting. Nothing happens. Really, the only stuff that happens is in the second half of episode 1 so far in this 4-parter, which gives me lots of hope for next week. What did you think? What's your overall thoughts on both these parts before we wrap up this episode then? What's your big final analysis on this episode?
When I was a kid, I was expecting something so much bigger because this was before Day of the Doctor when I first watched it, and the idea of all the Doctors coming together was something exciting, and I was expecting something so exciting. I hated it as a kid. I like it now. As a kind of it's so bad it's good kind of way. I enjoy it. I like the little characterization moments where the second Doctor's interacting with the third Doctor, the second Doctor's interacting with the Brigadier. All those moments are just wonderful. But as a story, it's just nothing. There's nothing to the story so far.
Yeah, I completely agree. I had never seen this episode. I'd only known about it vaguely, mainly just from clips on YouTube and stuff like that, when people were talking like, oh yeah, all the doctors met up like way back here, and this is what it was like. Experiencing it, I'm having a fun time going through it. Like it's very dumb, it's very silly, but it's entertaining. It is just when you do stop and be like, wait, what's going on right now? The answer is nothing. The answer is nothing is going on right now. It is completely a waste of your own time, but it's fun. It's a fun, lighthearted watch.
It's kind of the opposite to what Power of a Doctor was just last week, where everything seems to be happening at once, but nothing is happening. Whereas
but it was still fun. Both of them are fun.
Both of them are still fun. I'm still having a fun time with the Three Doctors. I'm enjoying it more than I did as a kid, and you know, it's something that's important to watch as a bit of Doctor Who history, because it set the foundations of what a multi-Doctor story should be. They should bicker. All this stuff should happen in a multi-Doctor story. And it's kind of important in that way, but if you want to watch this episode, set your expectations low, and you'll probably have so much more fun with it, I would say.
Definitely, I agree with that. But you could send us your thoughts on the Three Doctors special if you email us at whowatcheswhopod@gmail.com, or just leave a comment on the YouTube video or wherever. We will find it. We will read it out at the end of the month in our monthly news podcast and answer any questions that you've got regarding it as well. What are we doing next week, Scott? I bet I could guess.
Can you guess?
No.
Well, we're doing the next half of the Three Doctors.
Oh my god, I'm shocked.
And then the week after that, it's the news, and we are getting quite a bit of news. So far, the Doctor Who magazine hasn't dropped. But apparently it contains a lot of information, so we're going to be talking about that at the end of the month.
So excited to read that magazine. It is unbelievable. But yes, you could find us on Facebook at Who Watches Who, on Twitter at Watches Doctor, on YouTube at Who Watches Who. We've got a new URL, youtube.com/at Who Watches Who. Very fancy. Who Watches Who Pod. At Who Watches Who Pod. Fuck me, almost fucked that up. youtube.com/at Who Watches Who Pod. There we go. On Facebook... Yes, it's at Who Watches Who Pod. YouTube.com/at Who Watches Who Pod. They've got new, it's YouTube's new fucking username thing they're rolling out. It's weird. It makes it a really weird looking URL, but it does take you directly to the channel. The podcast is also available wherever you listen to podcasts in audio form. There's a bunch of links in the description. You can follow me on Twitter at Cloth223. You can follow me on Twitch at something orange. You can follow the stuff I do at Mess, youtube.com/MessYouTube. I'm all over the place. But until then, we will see you next week with the final two parts of the Three Doctors. Bye.